Welcome to episode 210, Supporting Jewish Clients Through Antisemitism and Creating Safe Spaces, featuring Dr. Liya Levanda. Make sure to subscribe to be alerted about future episodes. By Clearly Clinical. Learn, grow, shine. Hello to our listeners. My name is Beth Irias, and I am deeply grateful to Dr. Liya Levanda for spending some time with us today for a conversation about the dramatic rise of anti-Semitism in the United States and what we as clinical mental health professionals can do to acknowledge this, to address this, and to make safe spaces in our offices and on our couches for Jewish clients. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Levanda.
Hi, Beth. Thanks so much for having me.
So before we dive into this topic, knowing that there's obviously a lot here and we only have an hour, so there are going to be limits to what we can discuss, why don't you take a moment to tell our listeners a bit about you and about your background?
Sure. My name is Dr. Liya Levanda, and I am a psychologist specializing in Jewish clinical issues, particularly around anti-Semitism. This is something that I've been doing for over a decade in terms of anti-Semitism advocacy. I provide continuing education and informal didactics around these topics. This is all grounded in the belief that clinicians should be able to cultivate their social justice advocacy to be truly inclusive of every minoritized, oppressed, marginalized group.
Thank you. Thank you for being willing to have these conversations, and this is kind of where I'll just dive right in. This is a time of so much trauma for so many different people, and also such heated debate and tough conversation. Where do you think we should start today?
Gosh, what an overwhelming question.
I know. Have fun with that.
I think a really great way to start us off is to really orient ourselves to what anti-Semitism is. I think anti-Semitism, like many other isms, is one of those things where you think you know what it looks like, in that if you see it really blatantly, you see someone pointing their finger and saying, "You're a Jew and I hate you." You're like, "Yeah, that's anti-Semitism." And it's like, "Yeah, it is. Good job." And I think that anti-Semitism is one of those things that it's very difficult to identify because of how deeply ingrained it is into our systems, into our development, into our society. And the reason why I bring this up is because there's been a couple different attempts at defining anti-Semitism, but what the most widely known, widely used definition is, it comes from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. This is a couple dozen countries that came together post-World War II, post-Holocaust, and they're the only global body that's dedicated to Holocaust advocacy and things like that. And so the definition that they have, and I've pulled it up so I can read it out loud verbatim, their definition of anti-Semitism is, quote, "A certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities." And it, unquote, and it then goes on to provide all kinds of examples. And this feels like an important place to start because I think a lot of things can get confused in terms of, oh, can I criticize Israel, or is that anti-Semitic? Or, oh, am I allowed to protest, or is that anti-Semitic? And what I think is important for us to sort of ground ourselves in is that none of these things are inherently anti-Semitic. It's the way you go about it, and if you have enough knowledge and education around anti-Semitism to not toe that line, because it's a very, very fine line. It's very blurred. And without that proper knowledge and education, it's going to be really easy for you to unintentionally perpetuate these anti-Semitic tropes. There's actually really fascinating research coming out of the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, which is sort of the body that's been sort of tracking, anti-Semitic incidents. They've been doing a lot of advocacy. They had this really fascinating research that says the more you know about Jews, about Judaism, about anti-Semitism, the less likely you are to be anti-Semitic and hold anti-Semitic views. And so this really speaks to how important it is. If you are going to know how to combat anti-Semitism, you have to know what it is and what it looks like.
Thank you. And thank you for providing that definition, because I think it's easy to wrap our minds around. And I also appreciate what you're saying, which is that line of like, where is the line where something goes from being a statement to being interpreted as anti-Semitic. And I'd love to spend a little bit more time there, because this is so complicated. This is so controversial. Everybody has an opinion. And admittedly, as people in the United States, many of us are very sheltered from the realities of these different regions and the peoples and their cultures. And so we're consuming mass media, forming opinions, and then throwing them out there. But in doing so, there's so much potential to really other people. And that was a term that you had used before we started recording. So can you tell us a little bit more about the expression of anti-Semitism?
It is truly something that can be very insidious. And when I talk about anti-Semitism being insidious, I mean that it's not really easy to identify more often than not. I've had the privilege of interviewing the ADL's National Director of Anti-Semitism Programming, Mr. Vlad Chaikin. And he has this quote that really resonates with me that I share in all of the CEs that I do, which is that anti-Semitism dresses for the occasion. It's really easy to spot anti-Semitism when it shows up in cargo shorts to a black tie formal, but anti-Semitism is really good at following the dress code. So it's going to be really hard to spot anti-Semitism when it looks just like any other thing in our society. And that's part of what I am really noticing is anti-Semitism started out as something that was very intentional. If you think back to the First Crusades, if you think back, pre-Holocaust, these things often developed as very intentional ways of either making fun of, discriminating against, desire to harm Jews. And since then, those meanings have been forgotten, but the tropes are still there. For example, this shows up in media often. There's been this sort of strange trend where a lot of villains in media have large hooked noses. They have curly, dark black hair. They have very thick glasses. They speak in an accent. They're greedy, and this was started out as a very intentional reference to Jewish people. You can see this as early as The Witch in Hansel and Gretel. You can see this as early as Shylock in William Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. But this continues today. Recently, at the time of this recording, the Hogwarts video game was released, and that was Hogwarts and Harry Potter. It's been in the news a couple times because of their Gringotts goblins. For those who might not know, the bankers of the Harry Potter world are these short, balding, stubby goblins with these really big noses, and they're very greedy and they're very miserly. And that's a lot of negative stereotypes about Jews rolled all in one. But I doubt that was an intentional move on J.K. Rowling's part. She might have a lot of very problematic views about a lot of people, but more often than not, anti-Semitism isn't intentional.
Thank you for providing that framework and example. Stepping outside of the media and looking at this clinically. Before you and I started recording, we were discussing how many mental health professionals are called to the profession and passionate about social justice issues. And this water has gotten really complicated. It has been complicated. I think it's gotten really complicated since October because someone can be outspoken about beliefs by leaders really happening in parts of the world while also perhaps unintentionally creating a tone that lets other people know that they're not welcome, that they're not emotionally safe. Can you speak to that? And I think I'm pulling from the interview that we had recently with Dr. Mark Hamill and Cheryl Kamar, where they talk about it through the lens of do no harm. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think we walk a line as mental health professionals. Part of do no harm means being involved in social justice, advocating for those who might not have a voice or whose voices are not as strong as ours, wanting and pursuing a society where we don't have to help our patients navigate systemic inequalities, things that are out of their control. And on the other side of the coin, we also have to do no harm in providing care for people who we may not necessarily agree with or that we might view as the enemy. This came up a lot, I think, in Trump's election. And in that time period, a lot of therapists were very ambivalent and even resistant to treating somebody who might be a Trump supporter. And that can be a very difficult line to walk as therapists because on one hand, we feel a certain type of way about supporting people who don't align with our beliefs of supporting other people. And on the other hand, this is still a patient coming into our room, and we still have an ethical obligation to do our best to help them. And I think when it comes to this specific situation and this current conflict, what comes to mind for me is a lot of unintentional anti-Semitism, because I forget if I mentioned this when I introduced myself. I am Jewish, I am Israeli American, and I think a lot of people on both sides really can unite under this idea that we don't like the Israeli government right now. It's not doing a very good job. And that is very loud and clear across Jewish people, across Israelis. And yet what happens is people see somebody Jewish or they see somebody Israeli, and that person becomes their scapegoat. We see a lot of hate crimes that are at an all-time high, by the way, both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, where Jewish people who either look Jewish or have a Jewish-sounding name, they're targeted and they're attacked because they're viewed as, oh, doing this will free Palestine, or oh, you are responsible for what's happening right now. And there's a lot of anti-Semitic tropes out there and conspiracy theories about how Jews run the government. And this is definitely one of those times where, it would be nice to call up the Israeli government personally and be like, hey, knock that off. That would be great. But unfortunately, that conspiracy theory isn't true. And so what ends up happening is that a lot of Jewish patients feel afraid of going to seek therapy right now because they're afraid of unintentional anti-Semitism on the part of their therapist. It's not that I think a lot of Jewish patients are requiring that their therapist completely align with them politically. It's more of, I don't know that I can go to this therapist and know that they're not going to start spewing hatred against me when they find out that I'm Jewish. That's a very real concern that a lot of Jewish patients have.
I'm about to ask a question that is a gross assortment of, I guess, cultural stereotypes. Back in the day, when I was in what I call therapy school, we had our handy dandy giant textbook that is not on my bookcase that I'm trying to remember what the name of the book was, but it was something like ethnocultural awareness and mental health professionals, something to that degree. Prior to this increase, can you speak a little bit about how therapy was viewed within Jewish groups, within groups of people who are Israeli American, knowing that anti-Semitism has been alive and well in the United States for a very long time?
There's actually a very complicated relationship between Jews and psychology. On one hand, a lot of the people who helped shape psychology were Jewish. And on the other hand, Jews were really forced to assimilate when it comes to, delineating different groups. A lot of early theorists like Freud and Ellis had really negative views about religion. And so different religious orientations weren't really considered. And so what all that means is that today, I think in the case of of American Jews, I think they're definitely more open to therapy than perhaps other minority groups are known to be. I think partially because there's this sort of respect towards, the expert, like the doctor. And at the same time, Jews aren't a monolith, and there's such a wide range of affiliation with Judaism, how religious you might be, how culturally Jewish you are. And I think depending on your interpretation of Judaism, that it can sometimes become a barrier. There's actually been a surprisingly decent amount of research on Orthodox Jews. So these are really, really strictly religious Jews. But I think the majority of Jews in the United States aren't super religious. They might be more culturally Jewish. They might not attend services every single week, but they celebrate all the holidays. Their cultural experience is very much that of an American Jew. And they still experience that, both Jewish traditions and Jewish traumas. And so I think before October 7th, I think that Jews were, for the most part, pretty open to therapy. One of the stereotypes that I lovingly refer to is that Jews love to complain. And so the idea of being able to go to somebody and complain and kvetch at them was pretty appealing, I'm not going to lie. And I think that before, it didn't really matter as much whether or not your therapist was Jewish. But now, what I'm really hearing, both professionally and personally, is this is one of the only ways that a Jewish person feels safe going to therapy right now, is knowing that their therapist is Jewish, because otherwise they can't really figure out whether or not this person is going to be a safe person for them.
Thank you. Thank you for leaning into that answer, knowing that it is laden with complexity anytime we're taking an entire group of people or even a small group of people and saying, what do these people like? So thank you. And thank you for the nuance in that answer. I have a question. I don't know if you know the answer. What percentage of mental health professionals in the United States are Jewish?
That is a great question, and I don't know the answer to that. What's interesting about population is this is one area where Jews sort of look to be a model minority. Depending on where you are from, this may or may not surprise you, but Jews are actually one of the most minoritized minority groups out there. Jews are only about 2.4% of the US population, and they're only 0.2% of the global population. And a lot of people are really surprised to hear that, especially if you grow up in a place with a lot of Jewish people, which I think speaks really strongly to this idea of growing up in your own little Bronfenbrennerian bubble. You know, I've had people think that there were 50, there were 50% Jews in the United States, in the world, just because they grew up in New York, you know, and like that tracks, that makes sense. But I also know that in certain fields, Jewish people are disproportionately represented in terms of comparison to the US population. Like, I know that that's true for doctors, I know that that's true for lawyers, but I don't know if that's true for mental health professionals.
I was thinking about the point you made earlier about a Jewish person coming into therapy right now out of the gate, sitting there looking for providers and then thinking to themselves, do I think this person is going to be safe for me? And that bar, and goodness knows that that's true for many minoritized members.
Absolutely.
And that sometimes, often geographically, you may not be able to find somebody that checks that box. And we have so many people in mental health care right now, and also have more demand than we have resources. So then you add on more catastrophes, more trauma, more and more people needing care, and we're not able to provide it. But therein lies a really complicated problem where here you have a group of people who are increasingly feeling unsafe walking to their car, saying their last name. That's something that I've encountered. And also not feeling like they can go get help because they're not sure if it's going to be safe for them.
Yeah, it's a really tough thing to experience. And I think going back to what I was mentioning about unintentional anti-Semitism, I do think that there are many ways, really simple ways, that a provider can help Jewish patients to feel safe with them. Because right now, Jewish patients aren't looking for Jewish therapists necessarily because they're looking for somebody who shares that identity because they want to do a lot of this identity development. That's not necessarily what's happening, although it certainly is. What I'm seeing more and more of is this, they feel like this is the only way to guarantee their safety. I would in theory not have any problems seeing a non-Jewish therapist, but I have no way to know whether or not if I walk into that non-Jewish therapist's office, if I'm going to be re-traumatized, or if they're going to, say something invalidating or bring up Palestine or anything like that. And that can be really, really overwhelming. And on the flip side of the coin, Jewish therapists are also having a really difficult time right now, especially in having to work with patients who are directly saying anti-Semitic things to them.
Can you give us some more examples of unintentional anti-Semitism? This goes, this speaks to what are potentially macroaggressions, but also microaggressions of these things that we do without realizing. There's no way that you can possibly name all of them. What are the things that clinicians may have blind spots about?
Sure. And before I get into it, I really want to preface it by saying that I'm not saying that these things and the philosophies behind them are invalid. What I'm suggesting is there are specific ways that people go about their advocacy that can invalidate Jewish people. And I also want to make it sort of be known that I, along with many other Jews, are very much pro-Palestinian, and we support that movement. And at the same time, it's difficult for us, let alone for the entire world, to try to balance that with our own right to safety, right? Everybody deserves to feel safe. Nobody deserves to be killed. Nobody deserves to be held hostage, right? So I wanted to preface it with that before we get into it. But one of the things that I hear very frequently is that chant, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." And that is something that if a Jewish person hears, more often than not, they're going to like sort of shrivel back into their shell. Because for a lot of protesters, that it's a great rhyme, it's catchy, it's, very powerful. And for Jewish people, it means the erasure of the Jewish state. And I'll tell you why. The phrase "from the river to the sea" refers to the Jordanian River and the Mediterranean Sea. In other words, quite literally, east to west, the entirety of the land of Israel. And that chant is actually translated from a version in Arabic. And in the version in Arabic, the saying isn't "Palestine will be free," it's "Palestine will be Arab." And so what that chant is actually calling for is a complete erasure of Jews from that land. And that sort of inciting of violence can feel really scary for somebody who's Jewish. And the message that it sends is that Jewish people don't deserve to exist, or that they don't deserve to be protected, and that person's view of the conflict is not inclusionary of Jewish people, whether in the diaspora, like around the world, or in Israel. And so while Palestine absolutely deserves to be free in every sense of the word, using these things that have these connotations without having prior knowledge and education can be really harmful. Another example that I think about is there's like this pin with like this red hand that's been going around. It's not quite as ubiquitous, I think, but it's a pin with a red hand, and it's supposed to be signifying the call for a ceasefire. And on paper, it's like, yeah, that sounds great. Ceasefire, pin, let's go. However, the red hands actually symbolize a very violent incident in the Middle East where two Israelis accidentally crossed into Ramallah, and they were taken to the police station, and there was a mob that gathered, and those two Israelis were lynched. And in that event, one of the attackers who was in the building stuck his red hands covered in blood out the window to show the crowd that he had killed the Israelis, and the crowd cheered. And so that's what the red hands actually signify. So it's these little things where you really have to know what's going on. You have to know the story behind these things, because for Jews, they represent very different things. There's I forget exactly what the statistic is, but there was some relatively recent research that came out showing that with the phrase from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, I think it was like over 50, maybe like 60, 70% of Jews viewed that statement as meaning annihilation of the state of Israel. And only like 10, 15% of Muslims took that statement to mean the annihilation of the state of Israel. So the interpretation can really vary, and that's part of why it's so important to know about, okay, if I use this statement, is it going to be alienating Jewish patients, right? If that's not your intention, if you in theory want Jewish patients to feel safe in the room with you, saying that statement, it's going to drive a lot of them away.
You had mentioned a Jewish client seeking therapy, trying to assess, do I think I'll be safe here with this person? And you had mentioned, will the therapist bring up Palestine? Let's assume that Jewish client is with a non-Jewish clinician, or at least we could make assumptions for whatever reason that the client is assuming that this person is not Jewish. Depending on how any clinician approaches this, many clinicians believe it important to bring things into the room. Do you feel like right now it's inherently unsafe for clinicians to bring that up with Jewish clients, or is it a signal of safety, assuming it's meant with intent of safety?
That is a really wonderful question. I don't think that it's inherently unsafe, but I think there's a way you can go about it that can make people feel unsafe, and there's a way you can go about it that can help build the rapport and help people feel safe. And this is also going to be another one of those it depends kind of questions, because there are some Jewish patients who they are just really needing somebody to talk to about their feelings about what's happening. So they're going to be like, oh my God, I'm so glad you asked. And then for some patients, their coping is to just really ignore it. And maybe they're trying to come to therapy for something completely different. And so maybe they're not going to want to bring it up. And this is something that was observed, I think, well before October 7th, which is that it might take a couple sessions for a Jewish patient to even tell you that they're Jewish. And that's not because of anything that you're doing. It's just because a Jewish person needs to be able to suss out whether or not this is a safe person to disclose to. Because generational trauma, people's own experiences, it's not always safe to just disclose to any old person. This is something that I absolutely live by. Not necessarily in my own therapeutic spaces, because so much of what I do is around Jewish work and Jewish advocacy. But even people that I know, I'll straight up lie to them, Oh, what are you doing this weekend? If it's a Jewish holiday, they don't know it's a Jewish holiday. I'm not going to tell them it's a Jewish holiday. Not unless I've figured out that if I tell them it's a Jewish holiday, they're probably not going to react like, ugh, So to get back to your question, I think from a client-centered perspective and from a trauma-informed perspective, it's really important to let the patient define what's happening, especially when it comes to talking about their Judaism. I have a whole training on working with Jewish patients, and there's so many different ways that somebody can identify as Jewish, and so you can learn so much about what it's like to be Jewish and still not know what that individual patient's experience of Judaism is going to be like. And so thinking about both my experience as a psychologist as well as my experience personally as somebody who's Jewish, I think one of the most validating experiences that I've experienced, and the way that I can sort of pay that forward with Jewish patients, is, oh, how you doing right now? Just real simple, real open-ended. Because for a lot of Jews, even just the word Palestine can be really triggering, because that word is so often accompanied with vitriol towards Jewish people, unfortunately. And that sucks, because they want to support Palestine. But in certain situations, that can be really triggering. So leaving it really open-ended, leaving it for them to say, oh, you're Jewish. Okay, how you doing right now? There's a lot going on. You don't need to bring up the news. You don't need to bring up whatever just happened that day. For some people, it can be triggering. And just the ability to name, oh, you're Jewish, that's really difficult right now. That can be sort of that way in to help that person feel safe with you of, oh, this person knows enough to know that I, a Jewish person, am struggling right now because there's a war in the Middle East that I may or may not have any connection to other than the fact that I'm Jewish. That speaks a lot to people. And I think that is one of the best ways you can go about having those kinds of conversations.
Thank you. I appreciate your thoughtfulness in answering that question. These signals that therapists may feel called to make one way or the other, it's complicated because in saying, I stand here, it has so much potential to say, and I don't stand with you. And it means something different, I think, in this conversation, in this environment. How do clinicians walk that line of being supportive of clients and still, if they feel so called, taking a social justice position without being anti-Semitic?
Yeah. That's $1 million question, isn't it?
That is far bigger of a question than we have time to talk about right now, but go.
Well, what I will say is this is a really common question that I get often. How do I? How do I? And the answer that I give every time is that it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive, right? Our job as therapists, as mental health professionals, is to mitigate harm. And I don't think that support, you have to pick a side, especially when it comes to your patients here in the US. I think I find myself going back to that research that I mentioned of learning about anti-Semitism makes you less likely to be anti-Semitic. That's, I think, one of the biggest takeaways is so many examples of people being anti-Semitic because they didn't know any better. And I am sure that a lot of people aren't intending to be harmful in their advocacy. I talk a lot about how do we cultivate a social justice advocacy that is truly inclusive of everybody, right? And I think it is absolutely possible to be an activist, but also know how to be an advocate for everybody. Learning about anti-Semitism, it runs deep. People are really shocked, really surprised. I think something else that jumps out at me is this dehumanization that's been happening. And when we lose our sense of humanity, we lose everything. And so something that both sides have been really good at is the sense of dehumanizing the other side. And if we're able to shake that off, if we're able to really connect with a sense of common humanity, we're all humans. We all deserve to feel safe. I think that can go a really long way too.
What do you feel like are the most deliberate ways that clinicians can embody safety, cultivate safety for Jewish people, in addition to doing the work of getting the education?
This has been a very difficult war in that, and we joked about this before the recording started, there isn't really a single thing you can say that everybody's gonna nod and agree with. And what that means is a lot of people are really afraid of making public statements. And I understand that, you know. I've had, I guess, if you want to call it a privilege, I've had my whole life to learn about this. And for a lot of people, this is something kind of new to them, and they have a lot of catching up to do, and that's okay. But it also means that people are really afraid of making statements. And unfortunately, I think that if we're going to embody safety, if we're going to try to convey to patients, you can feel safe with me, we need to have some kind of messaging that says that. Doesn't have to be super direct. Doesn't have to be like I stand with so-and-so, but something that shows that you have nuance. I think that's what a lot of Jewish people are afraid of right now, is that people don't have nuance. People aren't able, from their point of view, what they're seeing is people not being able to acknowledge Jews are humans too. Even regardless of whether or not they have a connection to Israel, Jews are humans too. And so I actually, recently I saw that my name came up on somebody else's, another therapist's page. And I thought that's really weird. Why would they do that? And this therapist had actually had a list of trainings that she'd attended, and my name popped up because she had listed one of my trainings as a training that she'd attended. And I thought that was a really great idea, being able to show, I have some basic education in this. That's messaging that I think would help people feel safe, is I have basic education in understanding anti-Semitism. I have basic education in understanding Islamophobia. Something that can convey that message. And again, doesn't have to be a direct stance. It can be something as simple as mentioning, I did this really cool training.
Thank you. I appreciate that example. And I think you're right. Sometimes we, and when I say we, I mean social justice-oriented clinicians, feel called or compelled to make a statement, or even literally someone is saying to them, make a statement. Which side are you on? And I appreciate you building out kind of the complexity here because of the messaging that gets sent that becomes uninclusive.
Exactly. I think that's something that I really want to highlight. And you asked earlier about how do you balance being a social justice advocate and being a psychologist. I think that that's what it comes down to, is you are a social justice advocate, but you are also a psychologist. And so it is your ethical obligation to mitigate harm. And so part of that means, how do I be a social justice advocate that doesn't do harm? And that is something that I think is new, perhaps. And when I say new, I mean, I think a lot of advocacy focused in America can be pretty black and white, in the sense that police brutality, that's bad, We could understand how police and that institution had really racist beginnings. It continues to be racist. It continues to cause serious harm to our communities of color. It's very clear who the good guys and who the bad guys are, so to speak. And I think that that's something that happens a lot in American politics, is that there's a very clear side that you should support and a very clear side that you should not support. And, having spent so much of my life outside of the United States, that isn't necessarily replicated around the world. And I think part of what's happening is, we talked about nuance before. It's difficult to understand the layers of nuance and complexity and history behind what's going on. And it takes me right back to education, right? Like, it is so overwhelming. I don't envy people who only have had a couple years to learn about this, where I've had my whole life. But truly, education is going to be the biggest tool a social justice advocate can have if they're going to be advocates that, again, are truly inclusive of everybody.
You mentioned it earlier. I want to circle back to it. Generational trauma. Can you speak a little bit about that, and knowing that many Jewish people have felt hated for their Judaism for most of, if not all of their lives?
You know, when people think of Jews and generational trauma, I think the first and often only thing that comes up is the Holocaust. And in some ways, I can understand that. It's sort of the Jewish generational trauma that was most quote unquote recent. It's the most sort of well known in our society, but there's actually been a lot of Jewish generational traumas. The First Crusade, the destruction of the temple, October 7th is absolutely going to become another generational trauma. And even more like smaller traumas. And actually, there's been studies that have shown that this generational trauma has even impacted Jewish genetic expression. Like it is literally changing the genes of Jews. Say that 5 times fast. And gosh, when you experience such a community trauma, at least in what I will speak to, actually, I just thought of this. There's this piece of generational trauma that we've already held, and now we're seeing this play out in real time. A lot of younger Jews, and when I say younger, I mean that very broadly, in like the first half of their life, we'll say, before October 7th, were very dismissive of their parents who either lived through the Holocaust or were raised by children of Holocaust survivors. And those parents, those parental figures would say, you know, you have to be careful, the world hates us, da 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 da. And these kids would just kind of brush it off, like, all right, sure, whatever, that was the past, this is now, this doesn't happen anymore. And after October 7th, all these people were like, oh my God, my mom was right. My dad was right. My grandma, grandpa, they were right. Like, we are literally seeing the generational trauma being passed down, like live in HD, which is wild. It's nuts. And there's been research on generational trauma and community trauma that says it can be mitigated, that resilience can be fostered through increased sense of community, which is really huge in Judaism as well. I mean, even just within the religion as well as in the culture, there's really big emphasis on community. And the other thing is that resilience can be further fostered by support through the host country. So if the host country doesn't feel like a space supportive of Jews, they're going to have a harder time fostering that resilience. And I think about that a lot when we see how the world is reacting to the anti-Semitism that has come out from October 7th. It is so important for countries and societies to be supportive of Jews in order to foster their resilience in the face of this generational trauma. But if you have all of these acts of anti-Semitism going unchecked by governments, by university campuses, if you have people in power sort of downplaying the impact of anti-Semitism, that's going to be a problem. And it's, from a trauma perspective, like, that's really concerning.
One of the complexities of being a minoritized person in the United States is that the research doesn't necessarily catch you. So if we look at who is typically used for various research studies, there's been more deliberateness toward diversity in the recent past, but so many studies have called generally upon straight, college-age, white males, which automatically tells you a lot about that demographic. With that in mind, considering the cultural marinade, do you feel like there are particular models that are particularly effective with Jewish clients in relation to trauma treatment? Is it narrative work? Is it hard yes into EMDR or a hard no? Because this water runs so deep.
There hasn't been a lot of research to say. And this is something that I mentioned before that we see in the research. I mean, there's not a lot of research on Jewish populations already, but even less on the sort of cultural Jew, so the somebody who isn't like an ultra-Orthodox Jew. My colleague, Lenore Walker, who's very big in many psychology communities, she's with the Association of Jewish Psychologists. We're working on things around trauma with Jews and how to navigate that. But I think it's so important to acknowledge Jewish trauma. And I say that because one of the most common anti-Semitic tropes is denial of Jewish trauma. We see this in Holocaust denial. We see this in denial of what happened on October 7th. And what we know from the research on trauma is that experiences of delegitimization lead to more adverse outcomes. And so not only is it important to believe survivors of trauma, but it is especially important to believe survivors of Jewish trauma. And I think something that has been of significant pain to the Jewish community is the world not believing the sexual trauma that happened on October 7th, not believing the trauma that happened on October 7th. So what stands out to me in response to your question is, first and foremost, we have to believe Jewish people.
I appreciate one of the things that you said earlier about, some people, we want to talk through things, we want to process traumatic experiences or re-traumatization, and some of us don't. And I think that might be one of the more common inadvertent mistakes I think majority group therapists make with marginalized clients of any kind, is this kind of like, but we need to talk about the thing. Like, well, I don't really want to talk about the thing right now. I'm just talking about that coworker that eats too loud in the desk next to me. And I'm glad that you brought up that point. Knowing that we don't have a whole lot of time today, I think you've covered so much information about that nuance and how complicated this is. With the limited time that we have left, what are some of the takeaways that you feel like are most important for our listeners that are clinicians wanting to?
The first couple of things that come to mind are things that we've already discussed. The first is the importance of believing Jewish patients and believing and validating Jewish trauma. The second is just how important it is to learn about anti-Semitism, because just learning about anti-Semitism and learning about Judaism makes you less likely to be anti-Semitic, and that feels important. A third thing is something that we haven't brought up yet, which is whether or not Jews quote-unquote count as being part of the DEI umbrella. And this is really important to bring up because we've seen a lot of exclusion as a result, because there's this assumption that all Jews are white, that all Jews are greedy, are wealthy, have power, and so therefore are not capable of experiencing oppression, so therefore don't fall under the DEI umbrella. But that's a really harmful belief to have. Jews come in all sorts of colors, not just having light skin. Jews definitely experience a lot of oppression and discrimination, despite, maybe occupying some roles of power in American society. And I think part of the harm, part of the danger, part of the unintentional anti-Semitism is saying that Jews don't count as part of the DEI umbrella. A couple of years ago, the Stanford Counseling Center was in the news because their internal DEI committee had said that because Jews have power and privilege, that they don't merit the attention of the DEI committee. And that's a really harmful stance to have. When we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we talk about that for everybody. And like we talked about, Jews are one of the smallest minority groups out there, especially when it comes to religion. And so the third takeaway that I would like to leave folks with is that if we're going to be able to address anti-Semitism, and if we're going to be social justice advocates that include everybody in their activism, we need to be able to say, Jews do belong as a part of DEI advocacy. I can't tell you how many people, whenever I do my trainings, I like to sort of ask, how many of you have ever had a DEI type training? And of course, just about everybody raises their hand. And then I say, okay, well, how many of you have ever had a training on working with Jewish patients or anti-Semitism? And gosh, everybody's hand drops down very quickly. And that's not on accident, I think. I mean, not on accident. It's not the intention of those individual people. It's sort of the product of having excluded Jews from DEI movements for so long. So being able to sort of shift our view, shift our perception towards including Jews, as they should have been all along, I think is going to be another really big step that we as a field can take to combating anti-Semitism.
Thank you. I appreciate that you brought up that point because it wasn't something that we had discussed previously. And it also is another one of those issues that gets really complicated. There have been so many situations in even the last 5 years around conversation relating to Judaism and race. And I appreciate the point that you just make of people who are Jewish come in all different bodysuits. For our listeners that are wanting to learn more than this just very minor scratch of the surface that we've done today, what are some of your favorite resources? You've mentioned Anti-Defamation League. You've mentioned a couple of advocates and authors. Specifically, where do you send people when they are at the very beginning of understanding what anti-Semitism is and how it's affected Jewish people?
Oh, excellent. I actually have a resource list linked on my website, which is drlevanda.com. And it is specifically for people who are ready to take the step of including Jews in their social justice advocacy. It's got some of my favorite books on there, some of my favorite podcasts, great websites and organizations to know about. It applies to learning more about both Jews and about anti-Semitism. So I think that resource list is going to be a really great place to start.
Fantastic. Thank you. And you said it just a moment ago, but I would like for you to re-say it again. Dr. Levanda, for people who want to learn more specifically about your work, knowing that you are one of the people out there who's doing these really targeted trainings about supporting Jewish clients, what's the best way to learn more about you and your work?
Yeah, the best way is to go to my website, drlevanda.com. So that's DRLEVANDA.com. LevanDa.com. Or, let's be honest, I have a pretty unique name. My name is probably somewhere in the description. You can just copy-paste that into Google, and I'll pop right up.
Fantastic. Again, for our listeners, we've had the honor today of hearing from Dr. Liya Levanda. Dr. Levanda, I am so grateful to you for having this conversation with us today. These are important things to think about, and I know you've left me with some things to consider, and I appreciate the nuance that you bring to what is a really hard conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. For those of you who are listening, thanks so much for tuning in, and don't forget that learning more about anti-Semitism and Jews makes you less likely to be anti-Semitic. So just by tuning in today, you have started to take just a step towards that journey. So for that, I and any Jews that you may interact with in the future, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Levanda.
You've just finished listening to another exclusive continuing ed podcast by Clearly Clinical. If you like what you just heard and you need continuing ed credits, please visit us at clearlyclinical.com to check out our one-year membership, where you'll have access to our growing library of continuing ed podcast courses. Clearly Clinical, where our goal is to help you learn, grow, and shine.